Hello, and welcome to Batgaze, a podcast about evil and complicated queer people in history. My name is Ben Miller. I'm a writer and historian currently working on a book about the fashion designer Rudy Gernreich.
And my name's Hugh Lemmy. I'm a writer and author.
Last week, we talked about Elisar von Kupfer, a mercifully inimitable artist whose depictions of androgynous twinks disporting in the altogether hid more of a fascist political agenda. Who are we talking about this week, Hugh?
Before we start today's episode, I just want to give a content warning because there's some discussion of domestic violence in this episode. So today, I want to take you into the murky world of the Washington foreign policy elites.
Maybe the only world that is more psychosexually normal than British public schools.
And one of its murkiest characters, a man named Albrecht Muth. So who is Albrecht Muth? That really is the big question. Most of what we do know about him is down to the journalist Franklin Furr, who wrote an extended piece about Muth and his shadowy life for the New York Times Magazine in 2012. And it's from this article and Furr's research and a couple of other journalists' research I'll talk about at the end. And I've drawn much of the story that's been used in today's episode because it's a very recent story. So Albrecht Muth was a figure on the foreign policy stage. We know this much. In the 90s and noughties, he was the founder of an organization called the Eminent Persons Project.
The Eminent Persons Project. That sounds totally normal. Nothing to see here, folks.
The foreign policy world is...
Eminent Persons Project now sponsoring free trips to Little St. Jeff.
Yeah, the Eminent Persons Project is one of those names that you get in foreign policy world, which sounds drafted for a Bond villain or something.
It really does. There is a more scary kind of name for a U.S.-based organization, which is anything that contains the word liberty in it, is very bad indeed. I'm having to explain to German friends why Moms for Liberty is maybe the most terrifying phrase you can imagine in U.S.-American politics. But anyway.
The Eminent Persons Project was a sort of think tank that organized conferences and they produced research reports. And many of those research reports are actually still online because this was in the very early 2000s. So you can go on some really shonky old foreign policy websites and find a lot of their sort of stuff. And it gives a little taste.
Project for a New American Century. How's that working out? Every day, there's more and more of a rules-based international order, don't you think, Hugh?
So they give a sort of taste as to how Muth liked to present himself in public. So, for example, in a session of the First Continental Meeting of African Experts on Small Arms and Light Weapons, a sort of arms control conference that he organized, he introduces the former French Prime Minister, Michel Rocard, under his full title, Count Albie, the Honourable Albrecht Muth.
Count Albie, the Honorable Albrecht Muth.
Yes.
I think there should be, post-American Revolution, a legal ban on using noble titles in the United States. It's one of the few things we did right as a society, is getting rid of those things, and we really shouldn't fund any of that.
Like a lot of these sort of titles in America, including doctor, often, it's the sort of thing that can be assumed or bought without actually having the right to use it, and that might come up in this context.
I don't know what you're talking about. I think Dr. Phil is an extremely well-trained medical and psychological professional. Are you implying otherwise, Hugh?
No, I'm not implying otherwise.
No.
The proliferation of small arms in this post-Cold War context was his focus at the time, and he even published articles with the SAIS Review, which is like a foreign policy academic journal that was based out of Johns Hopkins University. So arms control was his focus, but it really wasn't his passion. His passion was the access to the rich and powerful that such a world brought him.
I was going to say maybe arms dealing was his passion, but maybe it will be. We'll find out. But
it's a familiar story, this sort of desire to be near the rich and famous. And the list of names that he was associated with was very impressive. Like I said, being from the early noughties, there's a sort of residue of this place in this society still online in these speeches and minutes from foreign policy events. And in one of them, the former Pakistani Prime Minister, Benazir Bhutto, thanks Count Albie for inviting her to talk at this EPG conference, while in a United Nations press release from the same time, the Count is numbered alongside foreign and defense ministers from the US, Russia, Brazil, and the UK. This professional proximity to Washington power mirrored what had long been established in his social life as well. He would claim that the US Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia had been his sponsor when he converted to Catholicism.
Oh, God, there's so many things wrong with that sentence.
Yeah.
One, adult Catholic convert. Two, Scalia being your... Whoa.
And he actually apparently asked Scalia to oversee his wedding. And he also claimed to have hosted a birthday party, 65th birthday party for Dick Cheney. along with his wife, Viola Drath. So now we're here, let's actually talk about his wife, who was a much better known, better respected figure on the US foreign policy circuit, because Drath, with her connections and respect, was really Albrecht's path into this proximity with power. So Viola Drath was born Viola Herms in Dusseldorf in Germany in 1920. As a young woman growing up in Nazi Germany, she became very interested in literature and theatre. She wrote her first play, Leb wohl, Isabel. Is that good pronunciation?
Leb wohl, Isabel. Yeah, live well, Isabel.
Yeah. She wrote that when she was just 18, in fact, in 1938. But it wasn't actually performed until after the war in 1946, some 8 years later.
Probably useful for her later.
By this time, she'd been working in the arts for a while as a dramaturge and a screenwriter. And so with the end of the war came new opportunities, and she began working as an interpreter for the military governor of Bavaria, Colonel Francis S. Drath. He was some 16 years older than her, and they became close, and they married in 1946, just as her career seemed to be taking off. Her second play, Kein Verlass auf eine Frau, was performed in Munich in 1948, but by this time she'd already joined her husband in returning to the US, and they settled in Nebraska.
That's a switch.
Yeah.
From Munich to Nebraska.
So in a Daily Beast article on Muth and Drath, the journalist Sandra McElwain quotes a friend of hers, Jerry Livingston, who said, quote, "To understand Viola, you have to understand she was a typical upper-level World War II German war bride. These women were submissive, they wanted to please. She was intelligent, knowledgeable about politics, and managed to launch a career for herself in the US." End quote. I don't know about being a typical war bride or submissive, but she certainly was very ambitious and intelligent. And actually, her life story doesn't really tell the story of a sort of submissive war bride housewife.
Yeah, I was going to say, the second part of that quote doesn't go with the first part of the quote. Maybe what the friend means is that she could appear to be the good wife. And then in the background, she was cogitating.
She received a master's degree in philosophy and German literature from the University of Nebraska, and she started working as a journalist and an author, writing textbooks about the German language and culture for American audience, as well as through criticism. She also worked for many German magazines, first the fashion and lifestyle magazine Madame, as their US correspondent, and then in 1968, she landed a job as the US political correspondent for the German newspaper Handelsblatt.
Okay, can I tell you something really weird? The reason why her name sounds familiar to me is because I'm doing research on Rudi Gernreich, who's an Austrian emigre fashion designer whose career blows up in the US. And he got a lot of international press coverage. And I absolutely 100% have a scan somewhere of an article that Viola Drath wrote about Rudi Gernreich.
Oh, wow.
At some point in the 60s.
Such
that name
world.
Absolutely sounded familiar, and that must be why.
I mean, it makes sense.
Because I remember that magazine, Madame.
Yeah, she was writing about fashion. And
he was a German emigre, or he was a German-speaking emigre, and so there was often a lot of interest from the German press. It may have been around the time that he did, in 1964, a topless women's swimsuit that was condemned on the same day by the Soviet Union, the Republican Party, and the Vatican. It's going to be a fun book. But anyway, back to the story.
So Drath and her husband moved to Washington, where he worked for the draft board. But interestingly, her career actually took priority, very unusually for the time. It was Colonel Drath, who was a house husband, spending a lot of time raising the kids, while Viola spent time building her portfolio of jobs. Being a sort of career journalist, and especially a political correspondent, takes up a lot of time. It's not a 9-to-5 job. You're always going to events, etc., etc.
Yeah, it makes sense. Also, was his military commission at that point through? But then that kind of sets up a nice, it's your turn, honey.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
And he was 16 years older than her. So he was, already at
the end of that kind of career.
And she wrote what's been described as gossip columns for the Washington dossier in the 70s and 80s. But gossip columnists seem to come up a lot in bad gays. And it's not actually a frivolous profession. There's some quite interesting stuff and investigations and stuff that happens under the guise of gossip columns.
Absolutely. There's two famous Hollywood gossip columnists, Hedda Hopper and Luella Parsons, were among the most strenuous enforcers of both the anti-gay lavender scare and the homophobic red scares. And they were both very active right-wing political forces.
And we've seen in past episodes, Nancy Mitford and Tom Dryburgh, both gossip columnists, whilst also being MPs and writers. And her writings on art and culture and their sort of political manifestations were serious. They were intentional pieces of criticism. I read a piece that she wrote about Brecht, taking a sort of pro-Brecht position in the sort of 1960s, not necessarily an easy, obvious thing for a sort of Republican Washington society lady to do.
Yeah.
She also wrote has to be said, quite poorly received biography of the German Chancellor Willy Brandt. Although it got panned in reviews, it did receive some very positive attention from one Henry Kissinger, who became Viola's friend.
Isn't it wonderful to be able to say that he's dead?
Yes, the late Henry Kissinger. Hallelujah. So,
as Betty Davis said about Joan Crawford, Mother told me to never say anything bad about the dead, only good. She's dead. Good.
So according to Frankenfur's piece, Viola would remark that, quote, "When I speak German to Henry Kissinger, he starts talking like a little boy," which is a sort of glimpse into the psychosexual profile of Henry Kissinger nobody wanted to hear. So I told you anyway.
I'm a little German boy.
Yeah.
No, Henry, you're not.
She might have had access to Kissinger's world, but she wasn't actually particularly showy or ostentatious, or known as a socialite or hostess. I called her a society lady. That's not even particularly true. She was pretty down to earth. She had a pretty humble life in a townhouse. She was obviously doing okay for herself, but she wasn't like a sort of hostess figure at this time.
She wasn't one of these Washington ladies. She was the hostess with the mostess.
No, she was quite dignified and reserved by most accounts. She betrayed what was called an old world style. Marcus Zeiner, the former Washington bureau chief for Handelsblatt, said, quote, "There was a grande dame image about her."
Yeah, and think about at this time in the United States when basically for the first time ever Washington is in the 50s and 60s, the global capital, right? In the way that London and Paris would have been the global capitals in the 1880s, 1890s, right?
Yeah.
Like many of the, how can I put this? A lot of the people who are leading that social world are extremely concerned with keeping up images and appearances, right?
Yeah.
Like you see Jackie Kennedy when she comes into the White House, is very concerned that there be classical music played at the White House, that the latest in fashion be worn, that the rooms be renovated because this has to represent a kind of globally powerful America. It shouldn't be Mamie Eisenhower in an ugly floral print dress. It shouldn't be a bunch of people who grew up on farms. And yet many of these people did grow up on farms.
Yeah.
And so anyone who had this kind of old world connection had a lot of credibility. And in any field in the United States of like high society, European at this time was a huge win.
Yeah.
Conductors were supposed to be European. Singers were supposed to be European. Fashion designers were supposed to be European. It gave you instant cred.
Yeah, this is actually a bit later. We're talking here about the sort of 70s and early 80s. But yeah, I think it still holds true to be a sort of, she was a respected voice in the Republican foreign policy world. She was an advisor in 1988 to Bush's election campaign and foreign policy issues. She was even a member of the very important US foreign policy think tank, the National Committee on American Foreign Policy. She, in fact, won one of their awards, so she was quite significant. And so as the Cold War was drawing to a close, her understanding of German political culture led her to be involved in drafting US policies towards reunification as well. But at the same time, she was dealing with a personal tragedy. In 1986, her husband, the colonel, died. Viola was bereft at this. She was almost incapable of looking after herself, and she was very lonely, and she was very scared of being alone. And according to her friend, Gary Ullman, she didn't even know actually how to make her own breakfast. Like her husband had been looking after her, doing these sort of house husband duties for so long that she was not really able to look after herself.
Oh, wow.
And her family said that she was terrified of being alone, and that actually might go some way to explain her growing closeness to this unusual young friend that she'd made, Albrecht Muth.
I see where this is going. This is turning into the milk train don't stop here anymore.
Yes.
That's an elderly widow and young gay seducing her perhaps to death, but let's see.
Yeah, exactly. So Drath had first met Albrecht Muth in 1982. Muth was also a German. He was born in Cologne in 1960.
You don't say with the name Albrecht Muth. I assume he was born in Barcelona.
You're assuming that's his real name. Everything's a bit slippy with Muth. Sorry, Colonel Albie. No, Count Albie. So Muth was born in Cologne in 1964, which makes him 44 years younger than Drath. And there's actually scant information on Muth's early life online. And in fact, the only thing really I could find about him is a biography in an academic dictionary, which seems to have been taken from a sort of long deleted Wikipedia page, which from its tone very clearly seems to have been written by Muth himself.
Okay.
So for reasons that, again, will become clear about his life, anything that is claimed by Muth should definitely be taken with a handful of salt. It appears that his family were originally from East Germany, that's what he claimed, and he also claimed to be the nephew and protege of Gerald Goering, who was the president of the Volkskammer, the East German parliament.
But then why is he using a noble title if he's from...
He picks up the noble title later.
Oh, God.
Yeah. The biography claims that he graduated from a high school in Bergisch Gladbach in West Germany, and that he'd been educated intermittently in the US, the UK, Germany, Israel, India, and France. So he's claiming that he's also a transnational
polyglot,
bourgeoisie elite.
Foreign policy types.
Yeah. His mother had been involved in politics. She was in the CDU, and his father...
It always comes back to the CDU in Germany. Do you remember in our last episode, we talked about Elsa Kupfer, and there was that other artist, Fetus?
Oh, yeah.
So he was, for a while, a revolutionary communist. Then he joined the Nazi Party. And then late in life, after the war, inevitably supported the CDU. If you're born German, at some point in your life, you become a CDU voter. It's natural.
So
it's the progression of things.
His mum was involved in the CDU. And then later in that Franklin Furr article, Furr suggests that she could have risen much higher in the party, but devoted herself instead to raising her children. And Albrecht was bitter about this because he felt that he'd been denied access to the power that would have taken. So that's what was his driving force. I don't know if that's true or not, but yeah, his mother was also involved in the politics world. And his father was an army doctor who died when he was very young. And he has two brothers from whom he is estranged. Somehow in 1982, he was in Washington. He was an 18-year-old intern for a senator. And he met Viola at these sort of Washington functions as part of his sort of social, political life. And why he honed in on her at this time can't really be known because she wasn't a lonely widow at this time. Her husband was still around. She was a professional, respected foreign policy journalist. But he immediately began wooing her. He took her for dinner at this schnitzel place that was apparently Kissinger's favorite schnitzel place as well.
Mm-hmm. Were the schnitzel made out of children?
And this isn't like a sort of like a coincidence or a light choice. There was something about Albrecht's Germanness that she was interested in, not necessarily romantically. She was still a happily married woman, but she was attracted to this reminder of her old life in Germany and his old world values. And when her husband died a couple of years later, Albrecht then began very intensively consoling her. He'd call her regularly, almost every day. And in retrospect, obviously, that's clearly a sort of predatory relationship.
He's right, yeah. It's, oh, come talk to me. I'll be on my shoulder,
yeah, exactly.
et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
By this point, Albrecht was studying at American University, which was at Washington University, and he filled this sort of lonely gap left by the death of her husband. They would spend a lot of time together. Muth would play the piano for her, and they would discuss their shared interests on foreign policy and diplomacy and have arguments about politics, and she seemed to enjoy his company. She was an elegant, intelligent, attractive, accomplished woman. She had plenty of potential suitors, some would say more age-appropriate perhaps. But in the end, she chose this young man who was almost half a century her junior over anyone close to her in age or status, because as she told a friend, quote, "They are old and boring. Muti is young and interesting." Muti was her pet name for him.
Young and interesting. That's a nice euphemism.
So in 1990, they got married. None of her family were invited to the wedding. And Muth then moved into the townhouse that Drath had previously shared with her husband. And at first, he took on many of the roles that the colonel had previously done. He was preparing meals for Drath. He was serving her tea when guests visited. He's remarked in one of the articles that he was almost like a butler. A friend remarked at how well observed this performance of service was. He said, quote, "He always struck me as being the perfect waiter, the way he served with one hand in the back. Everything was just perfect, as if he'd gone to school." End quote. But soon his role in this relationship with Viola expanded as she started to push him into sort of foreign policy circuits in which she moved. So prior to meeting Muth, her home had been a private space, but soon he began arranging and hosting these very extravagant dinners in this sort of Georgian townhouse. I found a photo of it online. It's not a flashy townhouse. It's nice, but it's not huge. It's a sort of row house. They weren't famous. They weren't popular because they were rich. They were popular because of their contacts.
Right.
And what they're hosting. And guests was always remarked, though, that there was still something always off about this young host. Like he dressed extravagantly, but not actually quite looking like a rich person should. If you're not from that world, you can't always fake it. You can get it wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And he was old-fashioned. He has old-fashioned habits, not just in outfits. But he had a very sort of fussy choice of European food that he served at these dinners. He called their home, her home really, the Albrechtory.
Oh, God.
Yeah. He smoked cigars. He would carry a riding crop, wear bow ties. And so you can get a picture of this guy.
Not a very pleasant picture, it must be said.
He called his wife Madam. He was weird, frankly.
There's actually an Ethel Merman musical about a Washington society hostess called Call Me Madam.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Ethel Merman ends up becoming the ambassador to some European country called, Schlin Blodlia. And they're all trying to marry her because she has the American cash, and they're class rich and cash poor, and she's cash rich and class poor, and sings this song about money. Do you need any money today? Anyway, we don't need to put my Ethel Merman imitation, but maybe we can leave it in. Who knows?
Yeah,
away.
Yeah, there was a weirdness going on here. A maitre d' at a sort of sushi restaurant that he used to visit said, quote, "You could tell he was a fake. He was like something out of a fable." And the Canadian ambassador to the US had also twigged that something was not as it was supposed to be. She later said, quote, "He came to a reception in a full morning suit, looking like a German aristocrat out in the 1800s. People got a little nervous and started digging around."
Because it's almost like he's doing a bit of being a European aristocrat rather than being a European aristocrat.
Yes, exactly that. Although she says people started digging around, they didn't dig very far. And I think really because he was the sort of person who oiled the wheels of Washington foreign policy elites. The hospitality he provided, including flying around ambassadors and high-profile politicians, was also accompanied by actually quite a savvy and attentive personal style. He was quite good at being social and remembering details about people and having thoughtful introductions and stuff like that. He was good at that. He wasn't weird in that sense.
And this is the kind of world where if someone is the husband of someone important and nice and you go have a fancy dinner at their house, there's not too much incentive necessarily to go scooping around and see who this is. Think about all of these infamous cases of various people who've pretended to be, especially from like non-European contexts, who pretended to be like representatives of oppressed political movements in their home country, and they get bought as such by Washington foreign policy elites who are really eager to believe that the people of wherever are just waiting for the CIA financed thing to free all the people from the whatever. And then of course it turns out that they're just lying. Right?
Yeah. So one thing that is notable about Muth's story is that as he rose through the system with his wife's help, we might even say complicity.
Wait, complicity? Did she know? I'm also just assuming that this man is not who he says he is from everything that you've been saying. You haven't really gotten there yet, but
it's hard to know. But there is a story later on where he tells this anecdote at one of his dinner parties, and the journalist says, "Oh, can I phone you tomorrow and get more information on that?" And he's like, "Yes, of course, blah, blah." And then as this journalist is leaving the party, Viola takes him aside and says, "Don't believe a word he says. Don't quote him on anything. He's not trustworthy." So she I think, especially as the relationship went on, it becomes clear that she doesn't believe him and sees him quite clearly for who he is. Early on, not. What's interesting is his role was always a sort of adjutant, an aide-de-camp, proxy or an organizer, but he was never, unlike his wife, he was never an expert in his own right on these things. He would speak at conferences, but always on behalf of ambassadors or introducing prime ministers. Like his role was always social rather than an expert, but he rose up because he was an expert at the organization, let's say, and the socializing. But nonetheless, with Viola's help, he was rising in influence through the connections that he made and the connections that those connections allowed him to make. He allowed the sort of reflected credibility and star appeal of the big names around him to sort of become part of his aura that would enable him to attract more people. It was actually in Furr's words, he calls it a social Ponzi scheme, which I think is a very, very good way of putting it. He would use Viola's connections, for example, to bring in politicians in town who were visiting from Nebraska who she knew, and then he'd use them to lure some slightly bigger fish for dinner on the promise of these other people coming to dinner or to this conference, that their attendance would lure in other famous people. You invite the two famous people by you say to Cher, well, Madonna will be there, and you say to Madonna, well, Cher will be there, and so they turn up. And he also had other tricks, like he found military attaches and other military officials who were visiting the town who, unlike other diplomats, were there on secondment, and so they didn't necessarily have their families and spouses around, so they're more likely to be in need of company and entertaining. And then their military expertise in particular was a very strong lure for foreign policy journalists.
Right.
He also laid out his method very explicitly in an email to his wife later. He said, quote, "You meet someone of import, check him out, determine if he can be of use, you make him yours. At some point, you must decide whether to run him as a useful idiot, he not catching on as to who you are from what you do." It's very explicit.
Oh, it's extremely explicit.
And the language as well, running someone as a useful idiot is pure diplomacy. That's running people is like you run agents.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So throughout the 1990s, this method was bringing Albrecht and Viola increased cachet. Like a lot of scams and Ponzi's, it appeared to be a flawless system. But unlike financial Ponzi schemes, where you can have a run on investments, people want their money back, and that can bring about a collapse in hours. For a social Ponzi scheme, there's an element where you can fake it until you make it. It does actually work. So
if Anna Delvey hadn't faked those bank statements,
she'd still be
she'd probably still be like a party girl in New York City. You know,
she was caught out because she had to spend to reach that, though, get into those circles.
Right, and
but he doesn't have to spend to get into those circles.
Exactly, he's got her money.
He's got, not a lot of money, but he can host in a way, and he has the access through her. If you lie about these confirmed guests to dinner or a conference to attract a big name, but then if a big name appears, your unconfirmed guests then do appear and confirm, and then you've delivered on everyone's investment. It is a flawless scheme.
And then they start confirming because they know that
you get Kissinger and
exactly
Scalia and whoever.
And don't you want to go to a conference with Kissinger and Scalia?
Yeah, without anesthetic.
I want to, maybe go and take some Ipecac and find a way of puking directly on them or something. Like George H.W. Bush on the Prime Minister of Japan.
But also, this is a scheme in which this is actually what a lot of politics and culture and art worlds, this is what it's based on. Like, he's playing the game as it's supposed to.
That sounds like how people who are successful in the art world are successful in the art world, which is they are psychopaths and then become successful in the art world.
Yeah, but there is, in this case, there's a crack in the scheme, which is the crackpot, Albrecht. As he gained fame, these sort of minor delusions that he had began to grow and became increasingly eccentric.
Oh.
He began wearing an eye patch.
Oh.
He claimed that he'd lost his eye whilst in Paraguay. According to some people, he said it was because while he was an ambassador. Other people said that he claimed that he'd lost the eye while fighting as a mercenary. The question is, did people really believe these lies? Like, maybe not.
But surely some of these people had seen him with the eye after he would have been a mercenary in Paraguay.
Exactly.
That would be like me following one of the targeted Instagram ads I get for Turkish hairlines and coming back from Istanbul with my hairline somewhere around my mustache and saying, "What's different? I don't know what you mean."
I think really if the champagne and the connections keep flowing and the money and the fundraising comes in and people make those connections, and do people care that the host is a little eccentric? Maybe it's even a charm. Like you get to this, he's a weird guy. He thinks he fought in Paraguay, but the duck à l'orange is beautiful.
Money, money, do you need any money today?
And it was working by the early 2000s. Albrecht had this think tank, the Eminent Persons Group, which was actually funded by Soros when it first started. And it was running it for a while successfully. He was going to the UN, he was doing these conferences, but his behavior was becoming increasingly erratic. He had distanced his wife from her family. They found his sort of belligerence and his capriciousness unbearable to be around, so they'd only see her outside her home. He was drinking more, and then when he drank, his charm very quickly turned into bitterness. Is very observable. They had always slept in the same room, but in separate beds in the same room. I Love Lucy. But at night, they would lie in bed arguing with each other in the dark in German. Married.
I can't think of a worse thing to do at night than argue in twin beds in German. I presume that's what my neighbors are doing all around me at all times.
Yeah, they slept in these separate beds. I'm sure a lot of the listeners will recognize in his behavior some of the sort of telltale signs of control and domestic abuse. And that is what was happening. In 1992, so only a couple of years into their marriage, she had actually filed a protective order against him. But she stayed with him, subject to his manipulation. And by the early 2000s, even that ruse begun to break apart. Right at the height of his success, his personal life was falling apart. Some sort of crisis that we don't know about, the nature of which we can't really know about, but hit him. He probably always was gay. There was no indication they ever had a romantic relationship. But in the early 2000s, he was open about his male lovers, flaunting them in front of her, etc. Writing to friends, he explained his relationship with Drath and his younger boyfriend like this. He said, quote, He was the boy, she was the wife. You have the one for one set of reasons, the other another. The lives were fully integrated.
It sounds extremely ancient Greek of him.
I mean, you can see the level of manipulation and humiliation probably that Viola was feeling as this sort of traditional, respectable, conservative German woman.
Of course.
And she seemed to have had enough because in 2002, she threw him out and he went to live with his boyfriend at the time. But that didn't last very long either. His boyfriend would also file another restraining order against him, just like Viola had. When he left, he actually threatened to have his boyfriend killed in a very sort of dark, sinister manner, saying, I have people. He says, be careful when you get into your car.
Oh.
So he returned then to Viola, but in 2006, he was subject to another criminal charge when he forced Viola to endure a prolonged, horrific beating at his hands. But she dropped the charges eventually and then threw him out. Not quite for good, but for a prolonged period. So by his own telling at this point, Albrecht's life, this is by his own telling, takes a very adventurous turn. He leaves the country and he travels to Iraq. This is in 2006, so it's just 3 years after the start of the invasion. And in Iraq, he ingratiates himself with Muqtada al-Sadr, the Shia cleric. He's like a political and militia leader. He leads the Mahdi militia at this time. And that's a very powerful Shia militia who were fighting against the US invaders in Iraq. So he was claimed to be working for al-Sadr as an aide, and he began this plan to end the war in Iraq by bringing the Mahdi army into the fold of the Americans, brokering a peace deal. Lovely. Easy.
Oh, God.
And he lives at this time in Muqtada al-Sadr's compound in a house that he called Villa Zarathustra.
Huh.
And he charms al-Sadr to his plans. He sees himself as a double agent almost at this point, that he's working for al-Sadr, but really for the Americans to bring al-Sadr into the fold. All the while, he's sending emails to increasingly angry and frustrated State Department officials in Washington who can't see the genius of the plan. And they think, if this is true, like, just fucking stop it. We have our own policy here. You can't be going around briefing on behalf of the State Department. You're not part of the State Department. But he sees himself as having this master plan. And his stories, his emails home are eccentric and picaresque, I would say. Is that the right word?
Yes.
So in one particularly colourful anecdote, he tells a story of how Muqtada al-Sadr had ordered the mosque's minaret speakers to play Prussian martial music in the morning to help wake him up. And he goes out onto his balcony to see how, quote, the honour guard performed in near perfection the exercises of Frederick the Great I taught them, the goose steps emanating straight at the waist, end quote. Come on, it's not believable. 2006, in Sada City.
It's like something out of a Mel Brooks movie. This like weird count, and then he's got the Stoddard militia fighters doing Prussian military exercises in the morning.
In this sort of courtyard of the compound with American Black Hawk helicopters flying over. Yeah, it's not real. But he was at the same time also negotiating with Viola his sort of return to their Washington townhouse. It's a fascinating story. It would be a very interesting part of his life, which would have been more believable had the phone calls that he was making to Viola not been showing on caller ID that they were coming from Miami, where he was working on the front desk of a hotel as a receptionist. I guess a sign of how pernicious and psychological the component of domestic abuse is, that and how he took advantage of her loneliness, is she actually allowed him to return. And he did, and he came back complete with his new Iraqi uniform, bedecked in medals that had been given by the Iraqi army. It wasn't actually an Iraqi uniform. It was cobbled together from ex-Jordanian and Iraqi army surplus that he's found around Washington, stuff that he'd ordered online. But he would still take regular walks around the neighborhood, this sort of suburban Washington neighborhood, dressed in full Iraqi military uniform, dress uniform.
Oh my God.
So obviously, to me and you, Ben, this sort of behavior screams Walter Mitty. He's a Walter Mitty character. It suggests someone whose eccentricity has passed through into a new stage of total delusion, but he continued to make reciprocated moves into Washington's foreign policy world.
Is this any more delusional than the war in Iraq was itself?
Yeah.
The belief that the United States would invade Iraq, this was the received belief of Washington foreign policy elite. that the United States would invade Iraq, topple Saddam Hussein, install a liberal democratic government, and leave within 2 years.
Was it not Blair who was talking about them throwing flowers in front of the tanks as they arrived?
They're going to greet us with flowers.
Yeah, I think because his pretensions flattered their pretensions, it worked. They wanted people to tell the story that he was telling. He organized and he hosted in uniform an event that he come up with called Iraq Liberation Day, which was like a wreath-laying ceremony for dead soldiers at Arlington Cemetery. And it was attended by US State Department military, Iraqi military officials. And he was there in his full Iraqi fake uniform giving speeches. He even hosted in his full fake dress uniform a banquet for the vice chief of staff of the Iraqi Joint Forces. Like none of these people were like, oh, well, where did you serve, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And the former US ambassador to the UN would write of him at this time, quote, to the extent Muth has been successful in aligning the Mahdi army with the US army and the Sadrist movement with US interests, and there is some evidence for that, he has made a major contribution.
Yeah, to the extent that the delusion is true, the delusion would be funny, but it's a delusion, guys.
Right. This guy's working as a hotel receptionist in Miami. So what is the evidence that the US ambassador to the UN is quoting here is that this is the point I'm trying to make, which is that there's so much self-delusion and fiction in foreign policy worlds where people want to tell stories rather than are looking at the evidence, that if you go in and tell the right story, you get taken along. And it's funny, actually, when it backfires. There's a sort of story of him going in and talking to, I think, an Iraqi military attache or an ambassador. I think perhaps the son or the nephew of the Iraqi president at the time. And he's bragging about his time in Iraq before the war and how he has these deep links with Iraqi society and the Ba'ath Party because he helped Saddam Hussein establish a secret service, et cetera, and the importance that he played in suppressing the Kurds. And all the time this guy who's watching him ushers him out and says, this guy must never come back because the guy was a Kurd. So he'd been going in bragging about how he'd supposedly assisted in the genocide of this guy's people.
Jesus Christ.
And so he didn't even know really what he was talking about, even on these issues. Like his faking was not convincing unless you wanted to be convinced, is what I'm trying to say. So eventually there's a sort of WikiLeaks crossover here at some point where he sort of is faxing WikiLeaks stuff to the US State Department, and they track this fax number it comes from, and it comes from their house. So they go to their house to investigate this hoax, and they meet Viola, and she doesn't want to meet them in the house. She meets them outside, and she's wearing these sort of big glasses to cover her black eye, which she claims she fell and whatever. But she told friends at the time that she was worried for her life at his hands. In August of 2011, Albrecht met a guy on Craigslist. They go out for a date, but he gets totally smashed. He just drinks far too much. And so the man drops him home at 10. Okay, date's over. The following morning, he calls 911 and he reports that he'd found his wife, Viola, dead.
Oh, no.
A 91-year-old's tripping and dying in their house is not unusual. But Muth's behavior obviously was. Shortly after her death, within a day, I think, he produces this letter apparently written by Viola saying in the event of her death, he's owed, I don't know, $150,000, $200,000, despite the fact that she'd already cut his monthly allowance that she was giving him from $2,000 to $1,800. And that was shortly before she died. And also she'd explicitly written him out of her will. So she'd clearly been trying to end the marriage. But actually, it wasn't until a medical examiner looked at the body that the foul play was determined. She had cuts and scratches, and he was the prime suspect. And his initial police interview, which you can read online, he makes it very clear that the house is locked up. He's pushing this line that it was an accident. But the medical examiner's report comes back and it says that it was blunt force trauma and strangulation. So this net is closing in on Albrecht. So he devises a new theory that actually his wife had been murdered by the Iranians, who had somehow got a key to his home and let themselves in, and that was in revenge for his work in Iraq.
Yeah, sounds real.
Yeah, and his behavior after she died was very eccentric. He sent an email to all of their close friends the next day, which read simply, "I'm sad to advise that my dear wife of nearly 25 years passed last night. Funeral arrangements are pending." And then in all caps, Albrecht. He talked about trying to find his wife's killers, and he began briefing newspapers like the Washington Post as to his sort of position on the death.
God.
Quote, "There being to them, the police, no one else who could have done it. I take no issue. I'm the first one to look to, so look, and then look beyond," end quote. He said that he thought he was going to be exonerated, and then he would help the authorities, quote, "look for the killer and bring all assets at my disposal to their side towards that end," end quote. It's weird language. It's sort of diplomatic language. It's someone who's lost in this fake world that he's created as a diplomat. It's not the words of someone whose wife has just died and is falsely accused of their murder. But he had no assets at their disposal, for a start. And secondly, the police weren't looking for anyone else. All the evidence, the scratches on his face, the scratches on Byler's body, the history of abuse, of domestic violence, the locked home, the closed windows, no sign of a break-in. So 4 days later, he was charged with homicide. And in court, he kept up these delusions. He claimed he was still a member of the Iraqi Special Forces, serving as a brigadier general. He actually complained that he was being forced to wear underpants, which he claimed the Iraqi Special Forces never do, and that he should be wearing his own clothes. In fact, the Iraqi embassy releases a statement at this time saying, quote, "We are deeply troubled by Mr. Muth's claim of his service in the Iraqi military. He is not currently and has never been a member of the Iraqi army. He does not represent the embassy, its attaches, the government of Iraq, or any government institution in any fashion. In the past, the embassy was aware of claims made by Mr. Muth and made it clear to all concerned that they were false and demanded that they must cease," end quote. But Muth still preferred to portray himself as this sort of dark diplomatic figure, a renegade or a mercenary or a spy who was operating on the edge of legality. And he wrote at the time, quote, "Throughout my time in Washington, I have been my leader's liaison to parties central to Iraqi-US strategic partnership. I cannot, I'm afraid, go into the sensitive aspect of my work." And he called his role, quote, "officially unofficial." So in jail, these delusions then take on a strange turn. I mentioned earlier that he'd converted to Catholicism and claimed that it was Scalia who had sponsored him in that claim. His sort of religiosity grows in jail, and he begins a series of hunger strikes that he claims he was directed to do by the Archangel Gabriel.
Oh boy.
Yeah.
Oh, we're getting into the real territory now.
Yeah. He's hospitalized 3 times. At one point, he weighs 40 kilograms. This is a big guy. The photos of him in Iraqi uniform, he's broad and tall. 40 kilograms, and he must have been close to death. But he always broke off his hunger strikes just before this unpleasant prospect of a court-ordered force feeding started. A psychological report by a forensic psychiatrist recorded that he was not delusional, writing, quote, "Mr. Muth knowingly traffics in illusions, not delusions. Since incarceration at a DC jail, he has been steadily trying to con everyone by creating the illusion of a delusion," end quote. So they rule that he's sane and perfectly capable of standing trial.
I see.
So he faces this trial for his abuse and his murder of his wife, the journalist and writer Viola Drath. He's found guilty and sentenced to 50 years in prison. The district attorney says after his conviction, quote, "Albrecht Muth's 20 years of violence towards his wife ended only when he strangled her to death in their Georgetown home. For the rest of his life, Muth won't be able to masquerade as a military officer or member of a royal family while subjecting his wife to intolerable abuse. He'll be a federal inmate paying the price for his brutal crime," end quote.
So that's where he is now. He's in jail.
Yeah, he's in jail.
Where he belongs.
Hi, you're listening to Bad Gays. We're an audience-supported show. We don't have a network, we don't have sponsors or advertising. It's really you guys who keep the show on the road. So if you're interested in supporting us, why not head over to Patreon, where you can listen to Extra Bad Gays, our monthly podcast about all things queer.
It's really fun to do. You get to hear from us every month. You get to hear from us in a less scripted format. We're starting to do fun new things like an advice column segment. Again, all of that is only for subscribers. You can also subscribe on Apple Podcasts right there in the app. We also have new merch for Season 8. We have t-shirts, we have socks that say Evil Twink Energy on them. We have caps in pink and camo and black. Go check it out, all at our website at badgayspod.com. All of that helps us keep the show going and do more of this, which we love to do.
And now, on with the show.
That's a kind of awful story of the idiocy of the Washington foreign policy establishment. Do you see Muth as being in this kind of tradition of people we've talked about, like Andrew Cunanan maybe, who are these kind of shapeshifters who are extremely displeased with their lot in life? Was there any information at all about where Muth actually came from and what it was that he was trying to run away from when he's adopted all of these different fake illusion personalities?
No, there's very little information other than that piece that I found which seems to be written by him. From that, I imagine, yes, he was probably born in Cologne and graduated and moved to the US. There's not much evidence of anything more interesting than that. What he's
Yeah,
run
maybe
away from.
we can speculate that there's some, maybe not. If there is an East German connection, this is wild speculation based on my knowledge of German history and society. Oftentimes, East German refugees who landed in West Germany, they were initially welcomed and given passports, but they often had a hard time. There was a sort of transatlanticist elite in West Germany at the time and in that region, North Rhine-Westphalia at that time. And so you could imagine him wanting desperately to be in it, like wanting to be like people he may have known who were actually these sort of jet-setting diplomats' kids. And
right. And growing up.
This is the world that Ursula von der Leyen comes out of, right? It's West German, post-war, semi-royal, semi-aristocratic.
Yeah, and I think probably growing up in West Germany during the Cold War, seeing America as a sort of almost like a promised land, it has this huge cultural influence. I don't think we can speculate on any deeper sort of psychological, social, psychosexual aspects to what drove him to do it. Some people do this. The other person who's a sort of similar story is Edward von Kloberg III, who was also a similar guy who wanted to rise into these sort of worlds. So maybe we can do an episode on him at some point in the future. But like Cunanan as well, like the way to get into these worlds is to flatter the self-image of the people who are in the worlds. And there's something interesting about all these characters who are manipulative, but they see very clearly the shallowness of the worlds they're trying to enter, that actually is very easy to, if you're willing to play that game.
Right.
Beneath the expertise or the class or the breeding or the nobility or the talent, actually it's about saying the right things to the right people. You don't actually need any of those things to be having dinner with Henry Kissinger.
What do you think? I made a joke about this earlier, about these kinds of delusions not necessarily comparing that much to the actual increasing delusion of the Washington foreign policy world. Is there a way where the transition from, let's say, the Viola of the 1980s, who's part of these sort of respected bipartisan commissions and is engaging in foreign policy in this very sort of respectable way, into this like delusional, I'm an Iraqi military soldier, I'm negotiating settlements with al-Sadr from my bellhop desk in Miami or whatever. Doesn't that in a way mirror the actual path of U.S. foreign policy in this time, especially Republican foreign policy? Like you see it turn from this very kind of steady-handed imperial maintenance, which of course involves a tremendous amount of violence. I'm not saying that it was good U.S. foreign policy of the 70s and 80s, but the Bush administration is where it really does seem to...
It's cautious.
It's right. And then Bush administrations when all these people start, at least spiritually speaking, smoking meth. And it turns into this like delusional project. And there's this thing called the Project for a New American Century, which is where the Iraq War comes out of. And if you read these documents from the 90s and the Project for a New American Century, it's less delusional that Albrecht Muth was a Mutada al-Sadr cleric than what's in there compared to what's happened.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. And I think also in this period, couple of years after the start of the Iraq War, when all the things that were supposed to happen didn't happen, when they weren't welcomed with the flowers, and when Saddam Hussein wasn't captured, and when there was a prolonged insurgency against the invasion, I think you see this beginning of grasping of narrative straws, of the desire to be able to tell the story to the American public and stay in office through claiming everything's going well. There's a really interesting anecdote, a really interesting example in the New York Times magazine piece, which I didn't include, but like really shows exactly what you're talking about in terms of this like sort of narrative collapse in the post-invasion period, where the guy who I was talking about before, who gave him this character reference, the Iranians had arrested and charged a sort of administrator of a humanitarian group operating in Iran and charged him of spying. And there's probably a sort of thing about prisoner hostage negotiations or something like this. So the guy who runs that humanitarian program, who's a former US ambassador as well, rings his friend who Muth owes a favor to because he's given him this great quote. And so his friend says, I know someone who can help negotiate these people's releases. He says, quote, I have a lunatic friend who pretends to have relations with the Mahdi crowd. I'll ask Albrecht if he can exert any influence. So what is going on there? He's like, yeah, this guy is a fraud. He's a liar. He's a lunatic. I'll give him a go. If he knows he's a fraud, he's a liar, or he's crazy, but I'll ask him anyway. And then this prisoner is actually released, not through anything that Muth has done, just because Ahmadinejad has this new re-election campaign and it's good PR for the Iranians. They release this hostage. And the guy's like, great, thanks again for being a miracle worker, he writes to him.
Oh my God.
Not about doing anything to get the hostage released. He knows the guy's a lunatic, but he likes to add the narrative. I know a guy who works for the Mahdi army who can negotiate. I'll put some pressure on. It works. You take credit for it. So things happen, and the foreign policy elites are looking for a story that they can use that makes sense of it, that tells the story that they want to tell.
No, this absolutely makes sense. And it really does symbolize the delusion of this elite.
Yeah, like the reason he succeeds so well is because he's a fantasist, and the fantasies are desired by the people who need them.
So Albrecht Muth, bad gay, not bad gay, not bad, not gay?
Bad gay.
I would say it's pretty simple.
Awful.
Fantasist, collaborator in horrible foreign policy, delusional wife beater.
The fantasy and the delusion otherwise could be an entertaining story, but obviously behind it is driven some sort of dark psychosexual aspects of control and violence and the murder of his wife.
If people want to learn more about Albrecht Muth, they would turn to this Franklin Foer article.
Yeah, which is very interesting. There's also a couple of other really good articles about it from before that were also doing a lot of the investigative journalism. So the Daily Beast, there's an article called Socialite Murder, Viola Drath and Albrecht Muth's Tumultuous Marriage by Sandra McElwain. The New York Times Magazine piece by Franklin Foer is called The Worst Marriage in Georgetown.
And there's some competition.
And then there's a bunch of other sort of news articles from the time. The Atlantic, The Odd Behavior of a Husband Arrested for a DC Socialite's Murder by Adam Martin. In the Washingtonian, 2 court-appointed experts say Albrecht Muth is competent to stand trial for murder by Carol Ross Joint. In the Washington Times, Drath murder case exposes bizarre lifestyle of Georgetown couple by Meredith Summers. And then there's another really interesting one with a lot of information about Viola's life outside of her marriage, which is in the Washington City paper, which is Viola Drath's Cultural Legacy, a look at the works of a murdered DC writer by Megan Arellano. There's also apparently a film that's been made out of it starring Christopher Waltz and Vanessa Redgrave, which I've not seen. It's a dramatization, it's a fictionalization of the same story.
So that's our show. I'm Ben Miller. You can find me online at benwritesthings.bluesky.social, Instagram at benwritesthings, and at www.benwritesthings.com.
I'm Hugh Lemmy. You can find me online at hugh.substack.com.
Until next week, bye.
Bye.
Bad. 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 Bad gays, bad gays, bad gays, bad, 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 bad.